Alright, sorry for the very long wait guys. It's been crazy busy for me, and I'm sorry if this video comes too late for some of you to be useful. Almost 3 years ago, I reviewed the reborn Sarcosuchus, and while very nice, it was also very big, way too big for 1:35. Well, on the heels of their diversification efforts, starting with the Coelodonta, we have now Haolonggood's own Sarcosuchus. The name Sarcosuchus is often translated as flesh crocodile, the Greek sarx, which means flesh, and then suchos from the Greek name for Sobek, the Egyptian crocodile deity. So here's the Sarcosuchus. You can see that the color is fantastic. It's very well painted, kind of a camouflage that you see in crocodiles. And of course right here, you can see that yes, it's got that updated kind of armor that we expect to see nowadays in Sarcosuchus. The length of this, accounting for this curve, is 29 centimeters or 11.4 inches. Sarcosuchus was estimated to be 9 to 12 meters or 29.5 to 39.4 feet. For 1:35, it represents a 10.2 meter or 33.3 foot animal, so it's a rather modest size on that scale. The model weighs 137 grams or 0.3 pounds or 4.8 ounces. Now this model comes in two color variants, and straight away you can see the difference in the green and the red over here. Now both are very well painted. Now the patterns are the same between the two, though the fade in the green makes it look different. However, when you come to the tail here, unfortunately you do see that these are quite identical, which is the modus operandi for most of Haolonggood's models. So let's take a closer look. Now here's the green variant, and straight away you can see how beautiful the coloration is. Very similar to extant crocodiles, which have these broken disruptive patterns rather than neat clean markings. Now starting at the head over here, I really like these pop-out eyes. Generally, the model's just really beautifully painted. Now these colors, I find myself unable to find the right words, but I think you see straight away what I'm talking about. And as we look at the textures here, you'll see that throughout the rest of the animal, they've added a coat of gloss, giving it a still wet look that's very appropriate. You can see the very sharp detail here, and again the skin textures are excellent. Here you see that famous bulla, and I like that the size isn't over-exaggerated. Here you see that the polygonal scales all look individual and differently sized and packed. The patterns and textures are very organic. Now opening the mouth here you see the business end of the animal. The teeth have a slightly translucent ivory and cream tone, with subtle variation from tooth to tooth, and reminds me of how reborn would handle their teeth. They're also nice and sharp, and nothing toy-like about them. And here you can see the commissural tissue, wet and gleaming, and even the tiny marginal teeth are handled very professionally. Now for the tooth count, Sereno et al. 2001 had the upper teeth at 5 premaxillaries. Now that's nicely reflected here. However, out of the 30 maxillary teeth, I count only around 22. There's no noticeably enlarged M10, though there's a general irregularity in all the tooth sizes. In the lower jaw, there were 31 dentary teeth per side, with the third and fourth enlarged. Now this model has around 26, and only the fourth is enlarged. However, real-life tooth counts may vary, and some developing ones might still be inside the jaw. So, to most people, this will be minutiae, but I mention them only for fellow anatomy nuts. Oh, just look at that. I wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of these teeth. And obviously the jaw articulates. Now here's the detail on the inside. See the oral tissue there? The palate has a glossy, wet appearance. I really wouldn't like to be watching this from the inside out. And the folds deeper in the throat are sculpted softly enough to feel organic. And you can see the subtle variation in the fleshy pink tones. Now we'll just go down the animal. Again, I can't express enough how happy I am with the complexity in the paint application. Well, let's look at the form of the hands here. Nicely crocodilian. And you see how the smaller scales interlock together. Again, the scales interlock in this beaded appearance, and man, you see how intricately textured the hands are. Now together with the aesthetics of those scutes, just amazing work, creating that rugged pebble texture so typical of crocodilians. And then we go down, and we see the way the colors just blend here, and together with the form of those scales, the two work really well together to give you a near masterpiece presentation. Down to the most minute scales around the toes. Very, very nice. Even the tiny digits have proper coloring instead of just simplified paint tabs. And on this side, just look at the gula region. I love those scales. You can see that even individual scales are complexly colored with color transitions. Again, the color complexity on this thing. If you look at these blemishes here, you see very dark markings, but you also see fainter ones that blend around and into them. Now of course, very importantly, we want to see that armor up close. By this I mean dorsal. Of course, it's all armor. Now this reconstruction from Sereno is very well known, and you'll see that regionally, the scale types do match in general. Now what's more, in the reflection, you see not just simple plates, but textures as well, with grooves, pitting, and other surface detail. The color pattern with yellow olive base is broken up by irregular black, and it's very nice to look at. The gloss finish really helps pick out these internal textures, while giving it that wet feel. Now it's not much of a pun to say that these details really shine in this model. The side of the tail continues the crocodilian armor logic very nicely. The scutes are more neatly arranged, but not artificially so. Each plate still has texture, and many of them have what look like bosses, which you do also see on modern crocodilians. And just a very quick look at the underside now. Comparatively simpler in detail, but realistic if you consider a real animal dragging or resting its belly against the ground and substrate, with more worn away ventral scales. I just love the broadening of the bulk over here. There's still regional variation in the ventral scutes, and they line up very convincingly across the body. So that's it for the green version. Alright, next I'm going to bring in the red variant. Now here's the red, and again, I think you see all the detail. It's all wonderfully present, and very nice to look at. Of course, all details are retained, and you see the dark mottling breaking up the face very naturally. Compared to the green, the red variant has a warmer feel overall, compared to the green and olive. Now inside the mouth again, look at the fineness of the teeth. Again painted without full white, but with warmer tones. In fact, this seems to be a little bit more bloody than the green. And we see the more reddish tint on these teeth over here. Now I'm going down the body now. Of course, you see the reason it's called the red version, with a very definite reddish-brown hue. Again, just a mix of colors here. You really wouldn't expect a mainstream company at such an affordable price to have this kind of paint application. It's just amazing what Haolonggood has done. And even right from the very beginning, they were giving us quality models with very good paint applications. Anatomically, there were some stumbling starts, but giving us these kinds of models with paint applications that are so high quality and yet still very affordable is something I'm grateful for, having collected for decades now. If you've seen the recent behind-the-scenes story of Haolonggood, it just makes it so much more enjoyable to know they've achieved this. Now here again, just in that one area, there's so much detail. Now I forgot to bring in the almond just now, so here's that comparison now. So that's it for the red version. As you can see, the coloration is also rather nice. It's so realistic, and even if you've only seen crocodiles once or twice before, this just feels real. Now of course, the next thing you want to see are the comparisons. The green version has a more classic crocodilian look, with stronger yellow-olive tones, higher contrast in the dark markings, which stand out more clearly. The red version feels warmer and earthier, with more reddish-brown tones. Alright, so let's compare the two, going regionally. Now first the face, where you see the same wonderful detail in both, including all the polygonal scaling across the entire face. But the body is where the red variant really separates itself, with a much warmer color. Because the red markings are softened with more blurred outlines, they look rather different. Now here in the tails, the repeated pattern is easier to spot, and once you line them up, the bands and the blocks are clearly matching. But even so, they still look good together because the color temperature is so different. And thanks to the flatness of this animal, I think I can actually lay them up one on top of the other for you to do your own comparisons. Overall though, I much prefer the green version. I like the sharper contrasting colors, and I find the pattern more visually striking. The red is more muted, which some of you may prefer. Either way, as with most Haolonggoods, whichever variant you get, you'll probably enjoy. So I think really having these two crocodilomorphs are such a pleasure. They're both painted very nicely, and even though the patterns are stenciled, they look sufficiently different just because of the color contrast. The next obvious comparison will be the wild safari Sarcosuchus. You can see that this is quite an interesting sculpt. Unlike this lying Sarcosuchus over here, which is in a typical prone position, this one is more of a high walk, so I think that's really unusual. Of course, one of the controversies of this Sarcosuchus is the apparent shortness of the snout. Now let's see here. When you compare it to the skeletal, it does feel short. I also think partly it's because of how huge the limbs seem to be in comparison to this. So if you think about the proportions here, I think it might contribute to the sense of discontent. Now in today's Sarcosuchus, you have more of the kind of length that you expect to see. Another thing I'm thinking as well is that you notice how the bulbousness here extends a bit more proximally down the snout, thereby giving it even more apparent shortness it wouldn't otherwise have. Whereas over here, I think you can see something that looks maybe a bit closer to what you have in mind when you think of Sarcosuchus. Another area is the bulla, which appears really bulbous and perhaps too tall. And there are the beaver-like appearance of these very long teeth. And also a diastema in the middle. Now, these nostrils are also very large. Here in the Haolonggood, you have none of these controversial features. In terms of the dorsal scutes, both generally follow the idea from Sereno, though the caudal ones appear a little elongated in the Haolonggood. While in the safari, they appear closer to the skeletal. Nonetheless, both are close enough for my crude standards. If I had to choose one, I'd of course choose the Haolonggood. Just much better paint job, and the size of the scales are more in scale with the animal than the overly large ones in the wild safari, and the snout and feet appear better proportioned. Now here's in case you want to compare it to the green. Now we have the outright monstrous rebore Sarcosuchus. Now this was a very nice model as well. I like the sculpted detail, and while I didn't like the spotted pattern at first, it actually grew on me over time. Unfortunately, it's oversized for 1:35. And bringing in the more similarly colored red variant into the picture, here you can see how ridiculously outmatched today's Sarcosuchus is. Now in terms of the armor, this does follow as well more or less the Sereno kind of interpretation. The paintwork at the time would be comparatively much simplified compared to what we have today. I love the form of the toes and all the regional variations in the scales over here. But I think when you look at the kind of color complexity that you have in the Haolonggood, not to mention the detail over here, overall, the Haolonggood still takes it. I might just throw in the wild safari into the mix. Not a fair comparison, I know. Next, you'll obviously want to see the contemporaneous PNSO Suchomimus. Now I've got to say, PNSO really has got the science of realistic bipedal poses without support right down. Fantastic how this stands up on its own. Just a beautiful pose. You can judge the relative sizes and decide if it's okay for you at 1:35 or perhaps a tad small. You'll also want to see the wild safari Nigersaurus here. Imagine this scene way back in time. And here's the size comparison with the Wilson T-Rex. And the Cameron. Now this is really a beautiful T-Rex, I must say. So all in all, I must say I'm very happy with the model. There are so many fascinating contemporaneous creatures that might have even threatened the dinosaurs, but I just never seem to be able to find them in 1 to 35. Now that we have one, albeit in a modest size, we get to see roughly how that scales with other 1 to 35 dinosaurs, which is a really valuable contextual illustration for your collection, not to mention the beautiful paint applications. Okay, so that's it guys. Once again, sorry this took so long. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you in the next video.